Hey guys, what's up? Paulo back with another video, and today we're going to be going over Unholy Nova. In yesterday's or a couple days video, I released a video going over all the changes we got in the latest beta build, but I want to kind of deep dive into Unholy Nova specifically. They addressed a good amount of the specific things that we were complaining about. There are some still oddities with the spell, so let's kind of talk about where it makes sense, what they changed, and all those things in between, alright? Let's get started. Okay, so first things first, let's go over the change. So specifically, the biggest change, and this is probably the one that the most people were upset about, was Unholy Nova no longer requires you to be in melee. So it is now a casted ability, meaning you have to have a target to actually cast this spell. It doesn't actually just fire. Now, by default, you can actually target an ally or an enemy with this. And basically, it just has a projectile similar to like Shadow Crash or something else like that flies to the location of your target at the time of your cast, and then deals basically the same thing it did before, right? So as soon as it hits that target, it does a single burst of healing, regardless if it's an ally or not, and then it also then radiates out the Unholy Transfusion dot. So everything in that kind of 15-yard range of wherever your target is gets the dot if it's an enemy, or gets that instant cast heal if it's an ally. And both of those guys are scaled based on how many targets there are. So effectively, the actual damage it does in that regard was left the same. Unholy Transfusion is still a dot, so that part is the same. They did rework its spell power though, but importantly enough, you'd no longer have to be in melee, right? You can just fire this off, let it travel. It does take a few seconds if you're at max range to actually hit your target. Not that big of a deal, but is something to keep in mind. It still does not do any initial damage, so the only kind of initial part when it reaches your target is that initial healing burst, but there is no kind of damage burst. It's just the dot that's actually doing damage. Now, interestingly enough, to help address another concern that people had with this was mainly that, you know, hey, on single target, the ability doesn't do that much damage. It's just like it's inconsequential at that point, which makes sense if it was an AoE dot, right? So to address this problem, they've actually done something very, very unique with Unholy Nova that I personally haven't seen them use before, which is they added square root scaling to the dot itself. Now, square root scaling is not a unique thing. This works on other things like Ascended Eruption. A lot of melee skills have this scaling, which basically what it says is you divide whatever that spell power coefficient is by the square root of however many targets that ability is hitting. So like just kind of a simple example, if you're just hitting one target with it right now, it will deal 375% of your spell power per tick. Now, however, if you cast it on two targets, instead of it being 375, it actually gets square rooted, divided by the square root of 2, which means each target gets ticked for 265% of spell power, right? So the damage curve is a little bit different, right? It's not going to do 375 on each target. It goes down a bit. So you are still adding damage as you scale targets. It's not like the damage is flat based on targets. So it's just not doubling every time you add a target like it would with a typical Unholy Nova or like before this change. So at one target, 375% total spell power. At two targets, it's 530% total spell power. And that will continue going up on there. So for the most part, you're looking at from like before and after perspective, it's going to do way more damage on single target and two targets. Past that, it's going to be about the same or lower as you scale targets. So this is actually an effective buff for raiding for sure. It is somewhat of a nerf, though, depending on the Mythic Plus context that you're talking about, right? If you're talking about its damage in, like, a giant pack of mobs, that went down substantially. But its viability on, like, you know, the Prideful mob or a boss or, like, a big priority target mob, that has increased. So, now, the interesting part of this, and this is kind of one of the main reasons I want to make this video, because it's not super clear, this is a little bit awkward to play around, a bit more so than before, right? Because it's a dot that lasts 15 seconds. So effectively what that means is when you cast the ability, you want every single target to live for 15 seconds. Like, that's your goal with this spell. Now, the problem with that is the square root scaling actually snapshots when you cast the spell, right? So that means if I cast that on 3 mobs, it will square root of 3 divide all the spell power, right? Now, the issue is if I cast it on 3 mobs and that third mob dies within like 1 tick of the spell, and then I'm just left with 2 mobs, those 2 mobs, that dot doesn't readjust. It will still continue ticking as if there were 3 mobs out. So you've effectively lost damage. So there's kind of an extra element. I don't know if it's like a gameplay loop that I personally enjoy yet. I do need to play with it a bit more first, but you know, you're kind of encouraged to wait or delay a cast, or make sure you only cast it on mobs that have relatively even time to dies, because if one dies early, you're kind of losing damage. So if you're like facing a pack of mobs and every mob has 80% health besides one that has like 10% life, you should delay casting Unholy Nova until that mob dies, assuming it's within a few seconds, right? There is going to be kind of a threshold of how long all of them are living versus delaying it and all that good stuff. So it's going to be a little bit of a weird choice of a spell of like when to press it, especially in those kind of Mythic Plus environments. So that might be kind of awkward. And I don't know, maybe this is fun. So I'm curious to see what you guys think. Like, do you like having to play around that? Because now there's 2 dimensions, right? You have to make sure they're going to live for 15 seconds and make sure that like an ad won't randomly die, right? Because before, the idea was still the same. You want mobs to live for the full 15 seconds. If one died, it wasn't that big of a deal. You just lost the damage on that one ad. But now you're effectively losing damage on all other targets as well. So it puts a little bit more depth to that gameplay. And again, I'm not quite sure if that's fun to play around. I know like a really quick fix here would just be it just readjusts every tick of the dot, right? Which, might be hard to implement. I know like that is much more CPU intensive for sure, at least on like my side. So I'm sure it's on Blizzard's as well. But it is going to be a little weird, right? Especially, and I did test this because I was curious, if you hit a critter, that counts, right? Like if a critter gets the dot application, even if it only takes 1 tick of it and gets overkilled by hundreds of damage, that will still influence the ticks on every other target out there, right? So, I mean, generally it's kind of a crazy problem. Like if you're, as long as you don't open with Unholy Nova, that's probably not going to be an issue. But like in a Mythic Plus environment or something like that. But yeah, definitely something to keep in mind because it is kind of, it's weird. So again, they could also just say, hey, the square root scaling doesn't affect on critters. I don't know. They could do a lot of different things here, but it is interesting that they did listen to that part of the feedback. So a couple other things to think about, right? It does have travel time, which is a little bit unique to the spell. So kind of, if you're familiar with Shadow Crash, if you didn't see it, did just get reworked and kind of reverted. But the old Shadow Crash, where it had its charges, had a pretty hefty travel time. I believe it was like 12 yards per second of travel. Unholy Nova is a little bit faster than that. So right now it's traveling at 15 yards per second based on spell data at least. Meaning if you cast it the full 40 yards, it's going to take up a few seconds to get to that location. Now this is actually pretty important because that targeted projectile does not follow your target. So wherever your target is at the time of casting, that's where it's going to land, right? So if your target is on the move or you're doing some crazy movement or whatever, it will not follow your target. So there is a bit of, you don't want to use it on a moving target kind of thing. It does have a fairly hefty radius of 15 yards. So it's going to be okay for most scenarios, but do keep that in mind that since it doesn't follow your target, you want to make sure that ideally your target is stationary for the first 1, 2, 3 seconds that you use it to make sure that it actually does infect everyone with the dots. So something to keep in mind there. Overall, I think this is a healthy change. I wish it was happening sooner so we could keep iterating on it because there are some oddities with the spell for sure. I do think that it is a little overpowered right now. Depending on the actual breakdown, and I'm still running the sims of like the overall Covenant, it's doing a lot of damage even in single target, which is a little bit weird. I think if you think about the Covenant abilities, like they effectively gave Unholy Nova this kind of ticket to work everywhere, where it's like effectively viable in every scenario, which is kind of an issue in the sense that from a balancing perspective, it no longer has like, oh, it's really good at this, because now it's the square root scaling effect basically means it's viable in all scenarios, which is great if you love Necrolord, but it is kind of weird considering our other Covenant abilities do not have that, right? So this is basically the only one that has like a flat use of like, this is always good, right? Because Night Fae gets worse in multi-target because it's already worse, so that's fine. Kyrian gets a little bit better in AoE depending on what you're doing or like how many allies you're around. It's really buggy, so it's hard to say. Venthyr has no scaling outside of single target, right? It just hits the one mob. So I think that's a little bit, I want to say unfair. Like if they're going to apply Covenant abilities to give this kind of, oh yeah, they work all over the place, that's fine. I think it's an interesting change, but without doing that for all of them, it's not going to be the greatest, and that's just kind of an oddity with this. Especially considering, like, just looking at Covenant ability versus Covenant ability, Unholy Nova right now, assuming your target lives, is hitting harder than Mind Games is, which is just wrong, right? Like, Mind Games should win in single target. It is the only Covenant ability that we have that is pure single target, so there's some tuning to be done here, which I'm getting a little scared, and this is why I said I wish it came earlier, because we only have a few weeks left. So, and the last thing I want is everyone to be like, oh yeah, I'm going Necrolord because it's OP as heck right now. But, that could very well and probably will get nerfed, or maybe the other ones get buffed. Who knows? I mean, Fey Guardians definitely need some help, but yeah, there's kind of opened a can of worms with this rework. Honestly, this is kind of, I think this is a great change. I just feel like it was a little late in the development cycle for iteration, so we'll see what happens. Hopefully I'll get some free time. I'm going to put all the thoughts in a forum post at some point. Make sure Blizzard sees that or watch this video. Hopefully get some more iteration going on this guy. But alright guys, that is it for this video. Hope you enjoyed the new reworked Unholy Nova. Really curious to your guys' thoughts on this. It's not a melee ability anymore, which is great. But yeah, again, big thanks to all the Patrons that are supporting me right now. It's just been amazing to see all the support. I know people have been asking. I say Patreon, Patron, whatever it is. I don't really care. I'm just really thankful that people are supporting me. It means the world to me that people care about this stuff. So thank you so much, guys, and look forward to all the new Sims and stuff in the description. Check those guys out when they come out very soon. And thanks so much for watching. We'll see you in the next one.